All right, good morning, everyone. My name is Mike Albertson, and I am the Deputy Director here at the Center for Global Security Research at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. And thank you, as always, for taking the time to join us. Today in the lecture series, we're very pleased to welcome Ankit Panda, who is the Stanton Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for National Peace, for his talk titled The New Nuclear Age at the Precipice of Armageddon. And the title of his talk happens to be the title of his new book, which fortuitously is out today. And the book discusses the changing landscape of nuclear security and strategy. I'm going to go ahead and put the link to that book in the chat as soon as I get done with my remarks so everyone can check it out as he's beginning his presentation. But if you are a frequent attendee at CGSR lectures and workshops, you know full well why such a book is needed right now at this particular moment. You know about the challenge of nuclear multipolarity, the so-called two-peer problem between the United States, Russia, and China, as all three of those countries modernize their nuclear arsenals. And people have differing opinions in the United States on sort of what to do next with that emerging arms race. You have the nuclear regional challengers from countries like North Korea and potentially Iran. You have the erosion and collapse of the legacy nuclear arms control regime, which kept a lot of things in check over the last 5 decades or so. You have emerging technologies increasingly getting into the nuclear mix, whether that's things like missile defenses, space-based systems, artificial intelligence, cyber capabilities. And Ankit's talk today is going to talk about sort of what all of this is going on, what it all means, why it's a change, and what potentially we can do about it. So let me say a little bit about the speaker. Like I said, he is a Stanton Senior Fellow in the Nuclear Policy Program at the Carnegie Endowment. His research interests include nuclear strategy, escalation, missiles and missile defense, space security, and U.S. alliances. He has consulted for the United Nations in New York and Geneva. He's advised a number of different combatant commands. He has written widely, particularly on North Korean nuclear capabilities, but he's also talked about South Korea and Japan in front of Congress. And pretty much if you look up his name, you will find a huge number of articles that he's written, including a very good War on the Rocks piece from a couple weeks ago about nuclear proliferation cascades, which I thought was particularly good. And if I track that down, I'll also put that in the chat so people can read it. So ground rules. The speaker is going to talk for maybe 40 to 45 minutes. He's going to go through some slides about his book. At any point during his remarks, please feel free to raise your hand electronically using the little button at the bottom of the WebEx, or get your questions into the chat. Just make sure that I'm on it, can see them. You can message me directly. You can message all the panelists. Feel free to get your hand up. Feel free to get those questions in basically whenever they pop in your head. And that way, when he's done with his remarks, we'll try to get as many people into the conversation as we possibly can. So, Ankit, thank you for being with us today, physically on site, and being out here in California on the day the book comes out, and very excited to have you, and looking forward to the presentation.
Fantastic, Mike. Thank you so much for the warm introduction. It's really great to be here. Let me just get my slides up. All right, you should be able to see my screen. And I'm going to jump right into it. So like I said, I really appreciate this opportunity to be here today in Livermore on the day that the book releases in the United States. It's really a pleasure to speak to this rather well-informed audience. This is a book that I wrote with multiple audiences in mind, but I must confess that the primary audience I had in mind for a book like this was probably people that don't know an awful lot about the issues that Mike alluded to in his introduction and the issues that the book talks about, i.e., conscientious global citizens who are otherwise well-informed, but have had the luxury of living in a world where they didn't have to think about nuclear weapons. And there is that dramatic word in the book's title, Armageddon, not having to think about that. That's something that I think many of us in the United States we've had the luxury to largely set the matter of nuclear war aside in our day-to-day lives for at least the 3 or so decades that followed the end of the Cold War. Of course, the salience of these questions, I think, has risen in the minds of many, both expert and non-expert alike, just in the last few years. So the overarching, I think, takeaway for why you should read this book, and if you should read this book, is essentially if you're trying to wrap your head around what people like me, people like Mike, and others, people working here at CGSR, other researchers who've really been enmeshed in the field of nuclear policy have been thinking about for really the last 5 or 6 years or so. There is a new thematic explosion of meaningfully new problems, meaningfully unprecedented problems that I think characterize this new nuclear age. But the book argues that fundamentally, a lot of what we are dealing with today does require, I think, a new set of intellectual tools to think about. We need to recognize meaningfully what is and is not new. It is the case that not everything that we face today is entirely unprecedented. There is a lot that still we can learn from the experience of particularly the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War, but from other cases as well. And so over the next 40 minutes or so, I'll try to go through some of the observations that the book gets into in greater detail, but I'll hopefully give you a bit of a sampling of why this issue of a third nuclear age is more relevant. But before I do that, I must, of course, point out that the observation that we are in a new nuclear age or a third nuclear age is not mine alone. It is an observation that I think has very much been percolating across the nuclear policy research community for the last several years. Here on this slide, you'll just see an example of articles, books, edited volumes, journal articles, a few published in just the last few years that allude to a new nuclear era, a new nuclear age, a third nuclear age. This is not a perception that I alone have about the current global nuclear environment. It is one that is widely shared. Of course, many of these articles that I have on the slide before you were published before I even started writing this book. And so as I went into this project, I went in with a fairly open mind, and I tried to ask the question, are these authors and analysts fundamentally right? Has something changed about the global nuclear environment? Is there enough here to meaningfully declare that we are in a new nuclear age? Which I think raises, first of all, the intuitive question, what do we mean when we talk about nuclear ages at all? And I think this is a question that reasonable people can disagree about. There are those who make the argument that there is no such thing as a distinct nuclear age apart from the nuclear age that began in 1945 with the arrival of nuclear weapons and their use by the United States in the concluding days of the Second World War. And since then, humanity has been living in a nuclear age, or the nuclear age writ large. I find that to be true in an important sense, but it doesn't really help us make sense of the thematic shifts, particularly the thematic shifts that come with the arrival of bipolar competition between the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War, and then the shift at the end of the Cold War, where nuclear weapons don't disappear, but they do recede from the core of international politics to the periphery. And I'll talk a little bit about what those thematic shifts mean in hindsight and how the reversal of that relatively benign nuclear environment that we enter in the 1990s really does lead us to this point we find ourselves at today, where many of those familiar Cold War dangers have returned along with a new cocktail of complexity involving greater multipolarity and technological complexity. So the bottom line is that talking about distinct nuclear ages, a first, a second, and a third, it's not something that is an ordained truth or something that we can't debate and dispute, but I do find it to be a useful way of conveying the thematic shifts that have taken place in the role that nuclear weapons play more broadly in international politics. So before we get into the new nuclear age, I think it's useful to just very quickly go over what I at least consider to be the hallmarks of the first and second nuclear ages. So I'll begin with the start, the first nuclear age. We begin in July and August 1945 with Trinity and the nuclear bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki at the end of the Second World War, and I date the conclusion of this first nuclear age to broadly December 1991 and the collapse of the Soviet Union, bringing about the end of the Cold War. The key characteristics of this period, I think, are really important, and I personally went back and spent quite a bit of time reading Cold War history and literature in the course of writing this book. And of course, we see this nuclear age marking the arrival of the discovery of nuclear deterrence and nuclear strategy, fears of what some called nuclear omnicide, that word in the title of my book, Armageddon, perhaps has never been captured more truly than at the height of the Cold War, when the aggregate megatonnage represented in the arsenals of the United States and the Soviet Union really did present a an existential threat to humanity like nothing else we'd ever seen on the planet before. You also see a process of adaptation and learning between the superpowers, between the United States and the Soviet Union, who together discovered the shared dangers that their reliance, respectively, on nuclear deterrence brought about for their civilizations and societies. This was a period of fear, of paranoia, and of persistent competition between these two countries to seek advantage and to mitigate the fundamental consequences of the condition of mutual vulnerability that would obtain between them. In the 1950s, the United States, during the period of American nuclear superiority, experiments widely with the political utility of nuclear weapons as coercive tools and as tools of signaling across crises in Europe and in Asia alike. The United States later, in the 1960s, begins to evolve its own conception of nuclear strategy, further exploring the relationship between nuclear weapons as political tools and strategic tools. The United States begins to evolve its nuclear strategy from counter-value targeting, i.e. the targeting of population centers and economic centers, to counter-force targeting, the targeting of adversary nuclear forces and command and control. The United States adapts its strategy at this time to better reassure its allies, answering some of the challenges of the conventional military balance at the time in Europe as well. But this is also a time of technological change. The nuclear era begins at a time when technological shifts begin to quickly accelerate. Nuclear weapons very quickly move from being exclusively bomber-deployed weapons in the U.S. arsenal to weapons that can be placed on intercontinental ballistic missiles that fundamentally change what used to be an hours-long lurch towards nuclear war to a process that would take on the order of 30 minutes. Nuclear forces become fundamentally a lot more survivable as well with the arrival of sea-based nuclear weapons. And this era of technological change drives a lot of intellectual discourse in the United States and elsewhere about the consequences and the relationship between technological change and nuclear deterrence. Albert Wohlstetter's famous observation that the balance of terror remains delicate appears to deeply permeate the American enterprise and the American approach to thinking about nuclear strategy. Deterrence and deterrent stability, it turns out during this period, are not stable and unchanging conditions in the mind of the United States and the Soviet Union, but gardens that need to be repeatedly tended to. The intense bipolar competition remains pervasive throughout the first nuclear age, but this is, of course, a period when nuclear weapons spread to other countries. I've largely talked about the US and the Soviet Union as the main protagonists of this first nuclear age, but they are far from the only countries who explored nuclear technology during this era. Other countries build nuclear weapons. Many other countries explore the acquisition of nuclear weapons. And it is during this first nuclear age that the United States and the Soviet Union, despite their many disagreements on fundamental questions about global order and their national interests, agree that a world with more nuclear states and centers of nuclear decision-making, be those centers friendly or adversarial, is a world that is inherently more dangerous for both countries. And so we discover the value of nuclear nonproliferation and move towards a nonproliferation treaty, and the United States largely formalizes and extends a system of extended deterrence by which it maintains assurances to a network of allies, hoping to keep those allies non-nuclear and largely in the orbit of the United States. This is something that we'll return to in talking about the stressors that we now face in the new nuclear age. Meanwhile, during this period, the salience of non-strategic and tactical nuclear weapons remains high, and extraterritorial deployment of nuclear weapons in large numbers is a practice that is quite common. With the end of the Cold War, we shift into what scholars and analysts would come to deem a second nuclear age. The salience of nuclear weapons for the major powers declines substantially. I think the most explicit way in which we see this, particularly in the relationship between Washington and Moscow, is with the unilateral presidential nuclear initiatives that emerged in 1991, whereby the United States and the soon-to-be defunct Soviet Union agree to pull back nuclear weapons that were deployed overseas. The United States withdraws all of its nuclear weapons deployed to Asia, and almost all of its nuclear weapons deployed to Europe. This is broadly a moment of great optimism. The task of global nuclear disarmament for the first time appears to be tractable. The United States and the Soviet Union have pulled back nuclear weapons. South Africa has disarmed in the twilight of the 1980s. The massive reduction in global nuclear stockpiles really does lead to a moment where we enter what the late Michael Crapon dubbed the golden age of arms control, which he identifies as a period that ran between 1987 and 2000. This is a period marked by the cooperative threat reduction efforts to secure the former Soviet arsenal and repatriate Soviet nuclear weapons to the Russian Federation as the Soviet successor state to inherit these weapons. The INF Treaty, the PNIs, which I talked about already, the Conventional Forces in Europe Treaty, Open Skies, a comprehensive global nuclear test ban treaty, START and START 2 between the United States and Russia. All of these agreements take place and build up a fundamental architecture and erect several pillars to create a safer global order that renders nuclear deterrence fundamentally more bounded in the role of nuclear weapons in the strategy of the United States and the strategy of other countries, including Russia. But of course, this is a period that's also marked by new concerns about the spread of nuclear weapons. Nuclear proliferation emerges as a major concern in this era in the 1990s, where countries like India and Pakistan, wary about the efforts to control the spread of nuclear weapons, decide that they must move towards overt weaponization, a process that began during the Cold War for both countries. With the loss of Soviet patronage, North Korea under Kim Il-sung and later under Kim Jong-il, this gentleman pictured on the right of my slide, moves towards the weaponization of nuclear technology, the reprocessing of spent fuel to extract plutonium, which the United States assesses is part of an effort for North Korea to potentially move towards a nuclear capability. The United States addresses these first with the agreed framework with North Korea. Later in the 2000s, concerns about Iranian proliferation also emerge, leading in 2013 and 2015 to two distinct agreements to limit the scope of Iran's ability to move closer to a nuclear weapon. Agreements in both cases that have since been rendered defunct. In 1995, I think, representing perhaps the apotheosis of optimism in the international community, the states parties to the Non-Proliferation Treaty agreed to an indefinite extension of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, ensuring that there would be essentially a permanent architecture erected that renders the grand bargain represented in the Non-Proliferation Treaty between its three pillars of disarmament, non-proliferation, and peaceful uses permanent. We'll again return to this. And finally, we have the increased salience of nuclear terrorism and non-state threats, particularly after the 9/11 attacks in the United States, and concerns about illicit nuclear proliferation, primarily as a result of the revelations concerning the AQ Khan network in 2004. AQ Khan being the gentleman at the top of this slide holding the soccer ball that is designed to represent a fission implosion device. So this chart, I'm sure you've seen this before, but this is just, I think, a useful encapsulation of the transition from the first to the second nuclear age. You observe at the late 1980s the apotheosis of total global nuclear inventories, represented primarily in the weapons possessed by the United States and Russia, and then leading to a dramatic decline as we head into the 1990s, the 2000s. The second nuclear age, of course, does not result in sustained optimism. That period in the 1990s eventually gives way to a post-2000 sense of nuclear malaise manifesting in a number of developments that I do think provide a set of precursors to many of the conditions that we now find ourselves dealing with in the new nuclear age. You have the U.S. withdrawal from the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty in 2002, which comes to be interpreted by Russia as a fundamental rejection of Russia's status as a superpower that is deserving of American respect and a dismissal, essentially, of Russian strategic concerns. Not immediately in 2002, but certainly later as relations between Russia and the United States decline. I've talked a bit about the collapse of the US-North Korea Agreed Framework, which also takes place in 2002, eventually leading to North Korea's withdrawal from the NPT, the first country to do so, and North Korea then in 2006 becomes the first country in the 21st century to detonate a nuclear weapon, and notably the first country to have left the NPT and have detonated a nuclear weapon. Russia annexes Crimea from Ukraine in 2014, sparking a crisis that, as we all know, manifests in 2022 in a full-scale Russian invasion of Crimea, but this also sparks a precipitous decline in relations between Russia and the West. In 2015, Russia suspends the Conventional Forces in Europe Treaty. India and Pakistan, meanwhile, are in their own era of nuclear learning during this period. Each country is developing and deploying more survivable nuclear forces, but they enter multiple crises in 2001, 2002, in 2008, and in 2019, and they go about efforts to modernize their nuclear capabilities. Meanwhile, we have new concerns about technological shifts and their implications for strategic stability. In 2017, the Trump administration arrives in the United States, providing a very different perspective on how the United States might relate to the global nuclear order, and particularly its system of alliances. And in 2017, North Korea declares that its nuclear deterrent is complete after testing intercontinental weapons, becoming the first country in 46 years, since China's test of an ICBM in 1971, to be capable of holding the U.S. homeland at risk with nuclear weapons. And that's where we enter, in my opinion, this new nuclear age that we find ourselves in. You'll note that I don't put an exact date on the start of this new nuclear age, but broadly speaking, I use the shorthand of the 2020s in the book, that the start of this decade marks a meaningful shift. If you look at many of the dates on this slide I shared earlier, a lot of these observations analytically about a new set of themes manifesting and amounting to a new nuclear age do emerge during this time period. So what are the prevailing themes of this new nuclear age? I think across the literature, you see a broad recognition that this new era is less stable and more complex than in the past, perhaps even more complex than the sources of tension that we experienced during the Cold War. There are three big takeaways that I have. The first is you have asymmetric multipolarity. This is not a nuclear environment that is easily understood as a set of dyadic relationships, relationships between country A and B who might find themselves in a nuclear deterrence relationship, but there are interlinkages between the major powers and the smaller powers. But I would identify the substantial emergence of tensions between the major powers, between the United States, Russia, and China in particular, as a key component of this new, more complex multipolar nuclear environment. Mike referred to the two-peer environment, which is certainly, I think, the way in which the United States has started to understand this new environment. But even beyond the two peers, North Korea remains, I would argue, a pervasive nuclear deterrence challenge for the United States going forward. Meanwhile, you have increasing ambiguity as a result of rapid technological shifts. Again, I don't want to be ahistorical. We experienced technological shifts during the Cold War and during the second nuclear age. But the confluence of technological change in multiple domains today, I do think, creates greater complexity for rendering nuclear deterrence stable, and the relationships between non-nuclear technologies and nuclear technologies creates new pathways for escalation, particularly as non-nuclear technologies proliferate to a greater number of non-nuclear countries that can now bear on escalation in crises implicating nuclear states. And finally, there is a broader return to an environment of normative precarity. And I identify this as a return because, of course, during the first nuclear age, we certainly didn't live in a world where the nuclear norms we now take for granted were deeply embedded. But of course, the fraying of these norms, especially after the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the emergence of greater loose talk around nuclear weapons, in my opinion, lowers the barriers to nuclear escalation and makes the contemplation of nuclear use by the states that possess them potentially more viable. So what is meaningfully new about this third nuclear age? Let's dig a little bit deeper. The multipolar dynamics I think we see are unprecedented and new. You see intense systemic tripolar competition between the nuclear great powers, multipolar linkages as countries like India and Pakistan react to shifts in China's nuclear force posture as a result of Chinese concerns about the United States, which might be reacting in its own way to broader concerns pertaining to Russia and other challenges. North Korea, meanwhile, reacts to US-China dynamics. I think we see clear evidence of this with North Korean investments, for instance, to cope with advanced missile defense systems. To just give one example, the UK and France adapt to new European realities. This is something that I think has increased in salience since I finalized the manuscript for this book. Of course, just in the last 3 months, conversations about the role that the United Kingdom and France might need to play in European extended deterrence arrangements has, I think, opened up substantially. We've moved from a golden age to potentially what might be described as a dark age of arms control. We've seen many of the treaties that I described earlier either be unilaterally abandoned or otherwise rendered moot through a variety of mechanisms. New START, the last remaining agreement limiting the central size of the U.S. and Russian strategic forces is due to expire in February next year. Neither the U.S. nor Russia are fully in compliance with that treaty at the moment, but that is the last thing keeping the two countries potentially from a significant buildup and potentially could lead to an acceleration of arms racing dynamics between the major powers. The nuclear testing norm is under strain as there are calls in the United States and calls elsewhere to return to nuclear testing. North Korea remains the only country to have carried out nuclear tests in the 21st century. That may no longer be true in the coming years. And we might be looking at ultimately the first increase in aggregate global nuclear stockpiles since the end of the Cold War in a meaningful way. Nuclear loose talk is a lot more common. We have populist leaders from Trump, Putin, Kim Jong-un, Modi, and others who've alluded to the use of nuclear weapons in various contexts, from domestic political contexts to signaling to various adversaries in the course of nuclear crises, raising the question about whether the nuclear taboo has become weaker. Strategic stability and new technologies, I'm going to talk about a little bit more in detail, but we have old problems like missile defense rearing their head again with new senses of technological optimism about what might be viable when it comes to missile defense. Offensive cyber capabilities, counter space capabilities, artificial intelligence, these are rapidly changing in a number of ways and could come to bear on the nuclear balance. Conventional weapons and non-nuclear states as well deserve our attention. Now, like I said, not everything about the new nuclear age is new. Multipolarity is something that the United States did think about during the Cold War. I've talked about the Cold War primarily as a bipolar clash, but we have evidence that the United States thought about targeting other nuclear players. If you look at the Single Integrated Operational Plan in 1962, the United States saw it fit to target China at the time amid concerns that China could potentially outcompete the United States following a nuclear exchange between the United States and the Soviet Union. This was the post-war nuclear predation problem that some analysts described during the Cold War. The second nuclear age also introduces greater complexity. There was a time, for instance, when the United States and Russia had serious conversations about the missile forces of other nuclear actors, including India and Pakistan and North Korea and potentially Iran, where there was a concern that the spread of missile technologies could render a global multipolar environment a lot more unpredictable. Multipolarity is also increasingly salient from China. In my interactions with Chinese experts, for instance, in dialogues on strategic stability, our Chinese counterparts often like to remind us that China lives in a neighborhood where it shares borders with multiple nuclear states, and that not everything that is happening in China might really be about the United States. I don't know how true that is, but certainly it is true that viewed from Beijing, the nuclear environment looks a lot more multipolar and has looked multipolar for a lot longer. But fundamentally, we don't have very strong intellectual underpinnings for understanding strategic stability in this multipolar nuclear world. We understand strategic stability rather well, I would argue. In two-player nuclear games, we understand that once both countries in a nuclear deterrence relationship possess secure second strike capabilities and broadly accept, even if they don't relish, the condition of mutual vulnerability between them, that some sense of strategic stability can obtain. But in a more complex multipolar world, I think we have broader questions about how to keep the spread of nuclear weapons and the use of nuclear weapons preventable. This picture is probably familiar to many of you. This is from analysts at the Middlebury Institute, not far from here in Monterey, California, that appeared in the Washington Post in 2021, showing what was the first of 3 new fields of fixed land-based intercontinental ballistic missile silos being built in China. And this is something that I really do want to emphasize because this is, I think, for the United States especially, the most meaningful shift in the global nuclear landscape that affects how the United States must think about nuclear strategy, about the future of arms control, and about strategic stability more broadly. You see this in the Biden administration's 2022 nuclear posture review, which identifies that the salience of nuclear weapons and the strategies of American competitors, including China notably, has increased and heightens the risks of strategic competition and the stakes of crisis and military competition. The bipartisan U.S. Strategic Posture Commission report in 2023 similarly observes that this new environment in which China is building up nuclear forces as U.S.-China relations precipitously decline creates various new problems pertaining to potential opportunistic or collaborative aggression in multiple theaters, posing meaningfully new challenges for the United States. So even if the United States thought about multipolar challenges during the Cold War and in the post-Cold War period, the kinds of challenges that now manifest for American strategy and the United States' ability to pursue its national interests across the world are meaningfully new in this new nuclear era. And again, don't forget Kim Jong-un, who I would say very much is an important contributor to this environment, even if he isn't a nuclear peer of the United States. The U.S. does now face 3 nuclear-armed adversaries that are capable of delivering nuclear weapons to the homeland. Let me move now to talk a bit about technological change, which I think will be of particular interest to many of you here in the lab community. So technological change has always created concerns. This idea of a fragile balance of terror, or a delicate balance of terror, rather, is very much related to the constant state of technological flux around nuclear weapons. During the Cold War, this largely manifested around new modes of deploying nuclear weapons as missile technologies advanced, precision advanced, multiple reentry vehicles became viable, and weapons moved to sea. But today, the cocktail of technological change is, I think, a lot more difficult to wrap our heads around, and particularly the vectors of change are meaningfully a lot more complex and manifested across domain ways, across non-nuclear domains, even domains pertaining to civilian technologies, and affect the nuclear balance in a variety of manners. So we have rapid shifts in the space and cyber domains, which create domain-specific challenges that intersect with nuclear weapons, raising the potential for escalation in the course of conventional wars. Artificial intelligence is very quickly advancing and iterating, and nuclear states are looking to integrate AI into command and control functions to support decision making, to enable strategies of counterforce, both nuclear and non-nuclear, and to even facilitate military deception tactics. All of this deserves our attention. Missile defense and the return of so-called ragged second strike problems are, I think, going to be an endemic feature of this new nuclear age. I, of course, wrote the book before the Trump administration articulated plans for a Golden Dome, but certainly I think what has happened just in the last few months with the administration's push for a comprehensive U.S. homeland missile defense system has and is going to draw a sharp reaction from Russia and China, who, of course, must continue to assure their ability to cause damage to the United States in a nuclear exchange, despite the fact that the United States is going to invest in new missile defense systems. The proliferation of advanced non-nuclear capabilities, including hypersonic weapons and precise conventional weapons too, expands the ability of non-nuclear states, and I would identify here several American allies, including notably South Korea, but even countries like Finland, Poland, Japan to a greater extent, that are going to have the ability to take the initiative in potential crises involving nuclear states like North Korea or Russia. And so preventing escalation in this environment not only requires us to think about the decision-making and postures of the nuclear states, but of potential non-nuclear players as well. And this proliferation trend is likely to continue. The fundamental big question that I ask in the book, and I think this is a useful framework through which to think about the role of technology, technological change on stability, is will technological transformations bolster or undermine confidence in secure second strike capabilities and command and control and assured retaliation postures? Will we ultimately find ourselves living in an offense-dominant nuclear world, which is fundamentally, in my opinion, a lot more dangerous? And so this is a framework for analysis that I offer. In the middle, you'll have the components of how I think many in Western military thought have thought about the kill chain, finding, fixing, and tracking targets, targeting targets, engaging and assessing the destruction of a target. Attackers, the countries that fundamentally see themselves as finders, here I would categorize the United States, will look to technologies that are quickly emerging and proliferating to render their ability to close the kill chain a lot more viable. But in the meantime, defenders, the countries that might perceive themselves to be vulnerable or besieged or resource limited, countries including North Korea, and potentially even China, which of course is not resource limited in any real way, but does perceive itself as something of a hider against the United States, will also look to many new technologies to disrupt the ability of the United States, for instance, to close the kill chain. And so the broad takeaway from this slide is that technological change is inherently agnostic on its effects for stability. It really matters how technologies are implemented. Any given technology, I think, in most cases, provides opportunities for both augmenting and disrupting the kill chain. And so we must inherently look to the specifics of how these technologies are being integrated into nuclear forces, conventional forces, and how they're proliferating to non-nuclear countries to fully understand their effects on global nuclear stability. A dark age for arms control. So this is, I think, an observation that has been brewing for quite a few years in the American discourse. It's not uncommon to hear or read observations from various analysts that arms control is dead, that arms control no longer plays the kind of bounding role on nuclear risks that it used to, nor can it, given the current state of political relations between the major powers. I've already talked about some of these treaty withdrawals and suspensions. Just for reasons of time, I'll move past this. But this is, again, where we find ourselves at the start of this new nuclear age. The observation I offer in the book is that despite the pessimism about the global state of arms control should not be viewed as an ends, but rather a means for bounding the scope of nuclear risks that we face. There is a lot of hard work that is, of course, underway here in the labs and elsewhere about new arms control modalities, verification technologies to render previously tasks that might have been considered intractable or politically infeasible a lot more viable. But ultimately, the problem that we face with arms control in the short term is going to be political. There will have to be political will. There will have to be an interest in the nuclear armed states to identify negotiated restraint as mutually beneficial. Conditions of mutual interest are a prerequisite for successful arms control, and those conditions largely do not exist at the moment between the United States and China, between the United States and Russia, India and Pakistan, and elsewhere. Nuclear politics and norms are also at flux in this new nuclear age. I've talked a bit about loose talk. There's a lot more talk in general among leaders in the nuclear states about the possibility of using and employing nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons have intersected with the growth of political populism in a variety of countries as well. The norms around signaling with nuclear weapons and threat making have also, I think, undergone a bit of flux, particularly as a result of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Ultimately, we must ask, does deterrence sometimes find augmentation from behavior that might otherwise be considered irresponsible? I would argue here that in the context of what Russia has done and what Vladimir Putin has done in the context of the Ukraine conflict, there may be something to this. Russian behavior around nuclear signaling is not something I would describe as responsible, but I would describe it as having broadly contributed to Russia's strategy of nuclear deterrence in the course of the war, which has been, of course, partially effective in accomplishing Russian political goals. Alternative multilateral approaches to nuclear weapons have also cropped up, the most prominent of these being the ban treaty, which seeks to do something that the NPT categorically does not seek to do, which is delegitimize nuclear deterrence and the possession of nuclear weapons. And so for the non-nuclear states that have been frustrated by the lack of progress towards global nuclear disarmament, i.e. a key component of the NPT's grand bargain, this has been an important vehicle to channel those frustrations. Although even some of the American allies who I think viewed the ban treaty perhaps as a vehicle worth engaging with have in recent years moved away as the salience of nuclear deterrence for these allies has also increased. So for instance, I was in New York recently when the ban treaty had a meeting of its states parties, and of course countries like Germany and Norway that would have observed in a different world were simply unwilling to do so. But this does raise a broader question about the future of the NPT regime that perhaps we can come to discuss in the Q&A session. Finally, we have the problem of proliferation and the growing pull of nuclear weapons, which is a problem that is manifesting in a way that it did during the Cold War, which is that it is now manifesting with American allies, countries that are wealthy, technologically sophisticated, and have found themselves content in the past to rely on American assurances. At the top here, you'll see an image that I extracted from a study carried out by the Chicago Council and my colleague Toby Dalton at the Carnegie Endowment, which surveyed South Korean views on both the alliance with the United States and the utility of nuclear weapons. This image, I think, is interesting because it actually challenges what might be an intuitive piece of conventional wisdom, which is that the pull of nuclear weapons will be negatively correlated with one's confidence in the alliance. But what you see here is that opposition or a lack of confidence in the United States' willingness to defend South Korea does not meaningfully change the pull of nuclear weapons for many of these respondents. And so in all cases, regardless of how strongly a respondent believed in the ability of the United States to fulfill its extended deterrence guarantees, the pull of nuclear weapons was still quite strong. And largely this is because of, I think, the utility that the nuclear states themselves attribute to nuclear weapons. Below, I have a sentence here from the joint statement issued by the 5 nuclear weapon states in January 2022. And in this statement, the 5 countries attribute very, very strong utility to their own nuclear weapons, that they serve defensive purposes, deter aggression, and prevent war. Yet they believe, of course, that these weapons should not spread. But as the international environment grows more dangerous, I think many American allies in particular have come to see nuclear weapons of their own as a potential solution to the fundamental problem of American unreliability. So U.S. extended deterrence today is in doubt. This was a manuscript, the book manuscript I finalized in 2024. I finalized it before the U.S. presidential election. But of course, developments since the election and since the inauguration this year, I think, have only accelerated these dynamics. Polarization. As I researched this book, I found that polarization and uncertainty in U.S. politics is the fundamental origin of currently allies questioning the reliability of the United States. These are not problems that are easily solved by software or hardware when it comes to the alliances that the United States has maintained for decades, but it's fundamentally the manifestation of a problem that really gets into what's happening in Washington and across most of the United States. The U.S. has, of course, played a unique load-bearing function with its extended deterrence in supporting global nonproliferation. The United States has rediscovered the problem of allied proliferation under the Biden administration, for instance. We had the Washington Declaration between President Biden and President Yoon, who's just been removed from office in the last few days in South Korea. But if you look at the Washington Declaration, it very much in its paragraph structure, in its spirit, borrows from Cold War era arrangements to, for instance, keep West Germany non-nuclear. So the 1965 meeting between President Johnson and Chancellor Erhard of Germany very much bore similar hallmarks. So the United States has revisited some of its Cold War playbook on allied proliferation, at least under the last administration, to address this problem. But of course, we today are, I think, in murkier waters still. There is, I think, a legitimate discussion today about whether the United States is in the course of relitigating fundamentally its grand strategy, the way in which the U.S. makes sense of its own role in the world and its relationship to countries that for a long time it saw as assets, as partners with which the United States had shared values and interests. Many of these countries are now largely being seen as liabilities, raising the possibility that these states will fundamentally become more willing to move towards nuclear programs of their own. I'm not a fatalist about nuclear proliferation. Nuclear enterprises are not cheap or cost-free endeavors. There are many hard questions that countries must, of course, answer about their respective strategies of proliferation. But I think it's undeniable that we today live in a world where the probability of nuclear proliferation is higher. And finally, I want to close with this observation, which is about the atrophying of nuclear expertise more broadly in the United States. This was an article that appeared in Politico magazine, I believe maybe last year or 2 years ago, that identified really a lacuna today in the broader community of nuclear strategy experts. And so there are, of course, many of us who work in this field But compared to the heyday of the Cold War, when the study of nuclear weapons and their role in the world was really a central component of national security thought in the United States and elsewhere, today we don't really see that. There is, of course, a return, as I've sort of charted out through this presentation. Given the many ways in which nuclear weapons have returned to the center of international politics from the periphery, I would think that there will be something of a resurgence in this area. But my hope is that this book at least offers readers who perhaps haven't thought about nuclear weapons as closely as some of us today have, that there will be greater interest in coming in. Let me close very quickly now with something of, I guess, what I might call the good news, because this has been a pretty downbeat presentation, I can imagine. In a way, the world we live in today is, I think, going to be fundamentally safer than some of the practices that we tolerated during the first nuclear age. Things like continuous airborne bomber alert, the wide deployment of megaton-class nuclear weapons in large numbers, delegated tactical nuclear weapons. A lot of this is not likely to come back in a huge way, and the learning that we endured in the first and second nuclear ages has long-term value, and I try to describe that at length in the book. All of the nuclear norms as well, testing norm, the norm against testing, the norm of non-use, the norm against proliferation, are all stronger than they were as well during the first nuclear age, when they either did not exist or were being initially adopted by the nuclear states and the non-nuclear states. And finally, the atrophying of nuclear enterprises and even the nuclear complex here in the United States does ultimately provide a practical guardrail on the ability of states and the desirability of arms racing and long-term strategic competition. Fundamentally, I do believe that for reasons of national resourcing and capability, the United States and the other nuclear states will have to be rather careful about the ways in which they choose to compete an arms race, because we frankly don't have the nimbleness and the flexibility we did during the Cold War to quickly adapt and render our nuclear forces a lot more flexible in their posture. When we think about charting a way forward here, I think there is a way in which I end up arguing in the book that the period that followed the Cold War was an aberration, that the fundamental condition under which humanity must coexist with the bomb is more likely to be competitive and dangerous. And so it's not that we should seek to return to that era, as desirable as it might seem in hindsight, but really managing nuclear precarity will require taking many of the risks that the book describes seriously. There are, of course, very good lessons to be taken from the first and second nuclear ages. Nuclear weapons and deterrence, fundamentally as human inventions, I think require human stewardship, diplomacy, and leadership. And so this is, again, a call to both expand the stable of nuclear experts and to ensure that going forward, we do have a steady stream of talent and effort coming into this world, ensuring that we can manage these capabilities that continue to pose an existential threat to humanity. And finally, I do think there will be a need to rediscover and even re-architect the ways in which we think about doing arms control and arms control verification, and to think carefully about the opportunities that new technologies might provide in this regard. So I close the book with some of these thoughts. I talk about the political factors here as well, the importance of prudent leadership in particular. But Mike, why don't I close it there? And I look forward to our question and answer and discussion. Thank you very much.